There is a word so powerful that 8 centuries after it was first whispered in the courts of Europe, it still shapes how we talk about murder, conspiracy, and fanaticism. Politicians use it. Journalists use it. Screenwriters build entire franchises around it. The word is assassin. And almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not misinterpreted. Wrong in a way that was deliberately constructed, carefully maintained, and ultimately served the interests of people who needed a monster to fear. The real story begins not with daggers in the dark, but with a theological crisis inside Islam that split an entire civilization and produced one of the most sophisticated political and intellectual movements the medieval world had ever seen. A movement that built libraries when others built armies. A movement that sent scholars where others sent soldiers. A movement that was, in the end, so threatening to the established order that the established order had to destroy not just its fortresses, but its very name. What you are about to hear is not the story of assassins. It is the story of how a name became a weapon. The year is 1090. In the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia, a man named Hasan-i Sabbah climbs to a fortress perched on a ridge of rock so sheer that a single path, barely wide enough for 2 men walking side by side, connects it to the valley below. The fortress is called Alamut. The word in the local dialect means roughly eagle's nest. Hasan-i Sabbah did not seize Alamut by force. According to the Persian chronicler Rashid al-Din, whose account compiled earlier sources, Hasan acquired the fortress through a combination of patient missionary work among the soldiers of the garrison and a negotiated purchase, after which the castle's commander was escorted safely away. It was a bloodless takeover of a mountain stronghold. Not the act of a fanatic, the act of a strategist. Who was Hasan-i Sabbah? This is where history becomes genuinely complicated, because the primary sources we have about him were written almost entirely by his enemies. The Sunni Abbasid chroniclers, the Seljuk court historians, the later Mongol-era compilers, none of them were interested in an accurate portrait. They were interested in a villain. What we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence is this. Hasan-i Sabbah was born in Qom, in central Persia, probably around 1050. He received an exceptional education in mathematics, astronomy, and Islamic theology. He converted to Ismaili Shia Islam as a young man, a branch of Islam that had been in open conflict with the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate for more than a century. He traveled to Cairo, then the seat of the Fatimid Caliphate, which was the primary Ismaili political power in the world. He returned to Persia as a missionary, a da'i in the Ismaili system, tasked with spreading the faith. The Nizari Ismaili movement that Hasan would come to lead was not a fringe cult. It was a branch of a major world religion, with its own theology, its own jurisprudence, its own philosophy. The theological dispute at its heart concerned the rightful succession of the Imam after the Prophet Muhammad. The same fundamental question that had split Islam into Sunni and Shia centuries earlier, and that within Shia Islam itself had produced further divisions. The Nizaris believed that after the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir died in 1094, the rightful Imam was his elder son Nizar, not the younger son al-Mustali, who actually took power in Cairo. This dispute, which sounds like a distant theological abstraction, had immediate and violent political consequences. It meant the Nizaris were now enemies not only of the Sunni establishment, but of the Fatimid Caliphate itself. They were, in the most literal sense, alone. Alamut became their answer to that isolation. From a single mountain fortress, Hasan-i Sabbah built something that historians have struggled to categorize ever since. It was not quite a state, not quite a church, not quite an army. It was a network, a dispersed, decentralized web of communities, missionaries, and fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria, bound together by theological loyalty and extraordinary organizational sophistication. The network operated in territory controlled by the Seljuk Sultanate, which was the dominant Sunni military power in the region. The Seljuks had the armies. The Nizaris had the mountains. And in the mountains, they built not just fortifications, but something that their enemies found even more alarming: schools. The library at Alamut was, by the accounts of those who saw it before its destruction, one of the great collections of the medieval Islamic world. It held texts on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. The Nizaris were not retreating from civilization. They were building one of their own. And yet, the Seljuks needed to stop them. The Nizaris were winning converts in cities, in courts, in the military itself. 2 Seljuk viziers, including the enormously powerful Nizam al-Mulk, were killed by Nizari operatives. These were targeted political killings, carried out in public, usually with daggers, usually resulting in the immediate death or capture of the attacker. This is where the history gets important, and where the myth begins to diverge from it. The Nizaris did use targeted killing as a political tool. This is documented, accepted by historians across the spectrum, and not seriously disputed. What is disputed, what is in fact almost entirely fictional, is nearly everything else that has been attached to the story. The legend of the assassins took its most famous form in Europe through one source: Marco Polo. Marco Polo, traveling through Persia in the late 13th century, recorded a story he claimed to have heard about the Old Man of the Mountain, the shadowy leader of the assassins, and his method of recruiting killers. According to this account, the sheikh would lure young men into a secret garden, a paradise of rivers, flowing wine, music, and beautiful women. He would drug them with hashish, the story goes, and when they awoke in this garden, they would believe they had been transported to heaven itself. Then, after days of pleasure, they would be returned to their ordinary lives. And the sheikh would tell them, "Follow my orders, kill my enemies, and you will return to paradise. Die in my service, and you will go there permanently." It is a remarkable story. It is also almost certainly invented. Marco Polo visited Persia roughly 150 years after the events he was describing. He never visited Alamut. The story of the garden and the drugs does not appear in any Islamic source. Not in Persian chronicles, not in Arabic histories, not in the accounts of writers who were openly hostile to the Nizaris and would have had every reason to use such a story against them. The historian Farhad Daftari, whose 1990 work The Ismailis, Their History and Doctrines is the foundational academic text on the subject, found no credible evidence for the Hashish Garden story in any primary source. The word assassin itself is the problem. Its origin is genuinely disputed among scholars. The most commonly repeated explanation, that it derives from the Arabic hashishi, meaning hashish user, was the interpretation promoted by medieval Crusader sources and later popularized by European writers. But this etymology has serious problems. In medieval Arabic usage, hashishi was a term of abuse meaning something closer to rabble or scum. It was an insult, not a description. And no Nizari source, no sympathetic account, no internal document ever uses the word in connection with hashish consumption. Marshall Hodgson, in his 1955 book, The Order of Assassins, first argued that the hashish connection was likely a slander, the kind of derogatory label applied by enemies to discredit a movement they feared. Bernard Lewis built on this in his 1967 book, The Assassins, a Radical Sect in Islam. More recent scholarship, including work by Farhad Daftari, has pushed further. The entire framework of the drugged, fanatical, paradise-seeking killer for hire may be a European and Sunni construction, applied to a movement whose actual methods and motivations were far more calculated and far less exotic. Here is what the Nizari method of political killing actually looked like, based on the historical record. The targets were almost always powerful figures: viziers, governors, military commanders, crusader leaders, whose removal would shift political conditions in the Nizari's favor. The killers, called fidayas in Arabic, were not drugged fanatics. They were trained operatives who spent months or years in preparation, often learning the language, customs, and social circles of their targets. Many infiltrated court environments as servants or scholars. The choice of the dagger over poison or ambush was deliberate. Poison was anonymous. An ambush could be blamed on anyone. A public killing with a blade, with the attacker making no attempt to flee, announced the Nizari's responsibility unmistakably. It was, in the language of modern political science, a demonstration of capability. A message. The message was, "We can reach anyone. We reached your vizier in the middle of his court. We reached your commander in his tent. We can reach you." Whether this constituted terrorism, targeted assassination, or guerrilla political strategy is a question historians continue to argue. What it was not was mindless violence by drug-addicted zealots promised paradise. The fidayas who carried out these operations almost invariably died. Some were killed immediately, some were captured and executed. The Nizari sources, the few that survived the Mongol destruction of Alamut in 1256, suggest that these men understood what they were doing, volunteered for it, and were held in high regard by their community. The image of the brainwashed slave, programmed through narcotics and pleasure, belongs to the propaganda of their enemies. Why did the lie take hold so completely? The Crusaders needed it. When a Nizari operative killed Conrad of Montferrat, the newly elected king of Jerusalem, in 1192, stabbing him in the streets of Tyre as he walked home from dinner one evening, it created a crisis of explanation. Who had ordered this? Why? The political situation in the Latin East was so tangled with competing ambitions, betrayals, and alliances that the true answer was complicated. The legend of the Old Man of the Mountain, the puppet master pulling strings from his mountain fortress, was a far simpler narrative. It located agency in a single exotic villain, rather than in the messy politics of Crusader succession. The Sunni establishment needed it for different reasons. The Nizaris were dangerous, not because they killed viziers. Political violence was common in the medieval Islamic world. They were dangerous because their theology was compelling, their organization was resilient, and their missionaries were effective. Depicting them as drugged murderers, rather than as a serious theological movement, made them easier to condemn and harder to join. And Europe needed it because Europe was building a mythology of the East, a place of exotic danger, sensual excess, and fanatical devotion. A mythology that served the ideological needs of the Crusades and later of colonial enterprise. The assassins fit perfectly into this mythology. They required no nuance. The end came from the east, not the west. In 1256, the Mongol general Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of Kublai Khan, led an army into Persia with the explicit objective of destroying the Nizari network. He had been negotiating with the Nizari Imam Rukin al-Din Kursha for months, demanding submission. The Imam stalled. The army advanced. Alamut fell in December 1256. The fortress that had stood for 166 years was taken after a siege that lasted, depending on the source, somewhere between a few days and several weeks. The garrison surrendered. Rukin al-Din was taken as a prisoner toward the Mongol court and killed en route. What happened next is a loss that historians still measure. The library at Alamut, tens of thousands of manuscripts covering theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature, was examined briefly by the Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who was present with the Mongol forces. Al-Tusi saved what he could, selecting texts for transport to Mariga, where he would later build his famous observatory. What he could not carry, the Mongols burned. The Syrian Nizari communities survived longer, maintaining their fortresses for another several decades under the Mamluk Sultanate. But the center was gone. The Imam's line continued. It has continued unbroken to the present day through the Aga Khan hereditary line. But the political and military network that had operated for nearly 2 centuries was finished. The manuscripts that burned at Alamut are gone. We do not know what was in them. We know only that they were described by contemporaries as extraordinary, and that their destruction was a deliberate erasure, not just of a fortress, but of a worldview. What remained was the legend. The word assassin passed into Italian as assassino, into French, into English. By the 14th century, it meant simply a hired killer. The theological specificity was gone. The political sophistication was gone. What remained was the exotic surface. The mountains, the drugs, the fanatical devotion, the murder in the dark. Dante used assassino in the Inferno as a simile for the vilest of killers. European courts used the word to describe any hired killer. In the 20th century, the legend was recycled endlessly in novels, films, and eventually video games, where the assassins became a secret society spanning centuries, fighting for freedom against tyranny. The franchise is brilliant entertainment. It has almost nothing to do with history. What the Nizaris actually were was something more interesting and more troubling than any legend: a minority religious community cut off from allies, surrounded by enemies, that developed a strategy for survival using the tools available to them. They built mountain fortresses, they cultivated networks of loyalty, they eliminated specific enemies through targeted violence when they could not fight conventional wars. And they built libraries because they believed that knowledge was inseparable from faith. The word assassin survived. The people it described were erased, first by the Mongols, then by centuries of myth-making that was more convenient than the truth. The Nizari Ismaili community today numbers somewhere between 10 and 15 million people worldwide. They are a peaceful, educated, globally dispersed religious community. Under Shah Karim al-Husseini, the Aga Khan IV, from 1936 to 2025, the community founded institutions of education, medicine, and economic development across the developing world. The Aga Khan Development Network operates in over 30 countries. It builds hospitals, it funds universities, it restores historic architecture. This is the living inheritance of Alamut. Not the dagger, not the drug, the library. The greatest lie the medieval world ever told was not that the Nizaris were violent. They were, selectively, when they believed they had no other choice. The lie was that their violence was all they were, that they were nothing more than killers, drugged and commanded, with no theology, no philosophy, no civilization worth taking seriously. That lie was useful for 800 years. It let their enemies destroy them without having to answer the harder question: what were they actually saying? What did they actually believe? What was in those books that burned? We will never fully know. The mountains of Alborz still stand. The ridge where Alamut once sat is still there, the ruins visible, the path still narrow. Historians still climb it, still measure the walls, still try to reconstruct from fragments what an entire civilization thought and wrote and taught before a general from the east decided to end it. The fortress fell. The legend was built in its place. And for 8 centuries, almost no one stopped to ask which of the two did more damage,